On the 2nd of September 1666, a baker named Thomas Farriner went to bed believing he had put out his oven. He had not. 4 days later, 13,000 houses were gone, 87 churches, old St. Paul's Cathedral, 500 years old, burned so hot that the lead roof melted and ran down the streets like water. 70,000 Londoners, out of a city of 80,000, had nothing left at all. And out of that ruin came something nobody expected. Not a new cathedral, not a new city plan, an industry. Today, insurance is one of the largest businesses on earth. Trillions of dollars moving quietly underneath almost everything you own. Your house, your car, your phone, your life, and nearly all of it traces back to one man standing in the ashes of London who looked at the worst disaster in the city's history and saw a business model. This is the story of how a fire invented insurance. To understand what happened, you have to understand what London actually was, not the London of today. In 1666, it was a medieval city, dense, filthy, and made almost entirely of wood, timber-framed houses packed shoulder to shoulder, upper floors that jutted out over the street so that the top stories of buildings on opposite sides of a lane nearly touched. You could lean out of your window and shake hands with your neighbour across the road. Every one of those houses was sealed with pitch, warmed by open fires, lit by candles, and that summer had been one of the driest anyone could remember. The city was, in the most literal sense, kindling. There was no fire brigade, there was no fire service of any kind. If a fire broke out, your neighbours came running with leather buckets and long hooks to pull the burning house down before it spread. That was it, that was the entire plan, and here is the part that matters most, the part this whole story turns on. If your house burned down, you were simply ruined. There was no compensation, no claim, no policy, no safety net of any kind. A lifetime of work could vanish in an afternoon, and the answer from the world was, that is unfortunate. That is God's will. Start again if you can. Nobody had yet had the idea that catastrophe could be shared. The fire started at 1 a.m. in Farriner's bakehouse on Pudding Lane. They woke the Lord Mayor, Thomas Bloodworth, and brought him to look at it. He was unimpressed. His verdict has echoed down 3.5 centuries. He said a woman might put it out, and he went back to bed. By dawn, 300 houses were burning. The wind that night was coming hard from the east, and it did something nobody was prepared for. It picked up burning fragments and threw them ahead of the fire into streets that had not caught yet. The flames did not spread. They leapt, faster than a man could walk, carrying his belongings. For 4 days, London burned. People fled to the river. The boatmen, sensing an opportunity of their own, charged a year's wages for a single crossing. Those who could not pay threw everything they owned into the water and hoped. Samuel Pepys, the diarist, buried his wine and his Parmesan cheese in his garden to save them from the flames. It is a small, strange, human detail, and it tells you everything about what people do when there is no other protection. They dig a hole. They hope. When it finally stopped, 80% of the walled city was gone. Officially, only 6 people died, but 70,000 had lost their homes, their trades, their tools, and everything they had ever earned, and every single one of them had lost it, with no way to get any of it back. Into this walked a man named Nicholas Barbon, and before we go any further, you need to hear his full name, because his father was a Puritan preacher called Praise God Barebone, and Puritans of that generation did not simply name their children. Nicholas Barbon's given name, according to the record, was, "If Jesus Christ had not died, for thee thou hadst been damned barebone." He went by Nicholas. Barbon was a physician by training and a property developer by instinct, a man described by his contemporaries as brilliant, relentless, and not entirely honest. He was rebuilding London for profit, throwing up houses on the burned ground as fast as he could buy the plots. When landowners objected, he was known to send in his workmen anyway and settle it in court later. He was not by any measure a good man, but he was a very clever one. And somewhere in that rubble, Barbon had an idea that changed the world. What if, for a small payment, made regularly by many people, you could promise to rebuild the house of the unlucky few? Most houses don't burn, but some do. And if enough people each contribute a little, there will always be enough to rebuild the ones that do. The many carry the few. Catastrophe stops being personal ruin and becomes a shared cost. It sounds obvious now. It was not obvious then. It was genuinely a new idea about how human beings could organize themselves against disaster. In 1680, Barbon formalized it, the insurance office for houses, the first fire insurance company in the world. And it worked, but it created an immediate and very practical problem. If you were now paying to rebuild burned houses, then you had a powerful financial interest in houses not burning. So Barbon did something extraordinary. He hired his own firefighters, private fire brigades employed by an insurance company whose job was to put out fires in the buildings that company covered. Customers were given a metal badge, a fire mark, nailed to the front of the house, so the brigade could see at a glance whether the burning building was one of theirs. Now you will often hear that these brigades would arrive at a fire, check the badge, and if the house was not insured with them, simply stand there and let it burn. The truth is a little softer than the legend. In practice, they usually helped anyway, because a fire next door very quickly becomes a fire at your own client's house. But the fire marks were real. Some of them are still there on old buildings in London, if you know where to look. Small iron badges, 300 years old, marking the exact moment that protection stopped being charity and started being a product, and London itself was changing around him. In the years after the fire, Parliament passed the Rebuilding Acts. No more timber fronts, no more jettied upper floors leaning across the street. Houses would be built of brick and stone, streets would be widened, the city would be made deliberately harder to burn. It is one of the few times in history you can point at a disaster and say they actually learned. London rebuilt itself so that 1666 could never happen again, and it never has. But laws could only change the buildings. Barbon had changed something else. He had changed what happens to you when the worst arrives anyway. The idea did not stay in London, and it did not stay in fire. Within a few years, in a coffee house down by the Thames, owned by a man named Edward Lloyd, merchants and ship owners began doing the same thing with cargo. A ship crossing the Atlantic might sink, most don't, so they spread the risk. Many men, each taking a small slice of a single voyage, so that no one man was destroyed if it went down. That coffee house became Lloyd's of London. It still exists. And from there, the idea spread into everything. If a risk can be measured, it can be priced. If it can be priced, it can be sold. Your house, your car, your health, your ability to work, your life, even eventually the weather, an entire global industry, one of the largest on the planet, worth trillions of dollars every year, built on a single insight that came out of the smoke of 1666. That disaster is survivable if it is shared, and there is something quietly strange about what that industry actually does. An insurance company does not sell you a product, it sells you a promise about a future that has not happened yet. It employs mathematicians to calculate with terrible precision the odds of your house burning, of your car crashing, of your death. It is a business that profits by being right about your worst day. And every one of those calculations, every actuarial table, every premium you have ever paid descends from a simple observation made by a property developer in a burned out city that most houses do not burn, and the ones that do can be paid for by the ones that don't. We think of the Great Fire as a story about destruction, 13,000 houses, a cathedral with a roof that melted, a city erased in 4 days. But the thing that actually came out of that fire was not the new London, built in brick and stone so that it could never burn like that again. It was the quiet, invisible machinery that now sits underneath almost every valuable thing you own, waiting silently for the worst day of your life. Every insurance policy on Earth is, in a sense, a descendant of one bad night on Pudding Lane, of a baker who thought he had put out his oven, and of a man standing in the ruins afterwards doing the arithmetic.